Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of Harry Potter Theory. In today's video, we're going to be discussing Hogwarts' lovable divination professor, Sybill Trelawney. However, we're not just going to be discussing one or two aspects of her character, we're going to be discussing it all, from her life as a young witch to the time she spent teaching and beyond. There's a lot of ground to cover here, so let's get into it. First things first, what did Sybill Trelawney look like? What were her physical characteristics? Harry's first impression of Trolloni was as follows. Harry's immediate impression was of a large, glittering insect. Professor Trelawney moved into the firelight, and they saw that she was very thin. Her large glasses magnified her eyes to several times their natural size, and she was draped in gauzy, spangled shawl. Innumerable chains and beads hung around her spindly neck, and her arms and hands were encrusted with bangles and rings. Sybill Trelawney was a thin woman, often draped in robes and adorned with glittering beads and accessories. She wore thick glasses that magnified her eyes, and she spoke in a sort of soft, passive voice that could quickly change if she became upset. She was a very unusual and eccentric woman that conducted herself in an almost theatrical way. Though Trelawney worked at Hogwarts, she was very much aware of what people thought of her and her field, which meant that she would spend a lot of time by herself. Unfortunately, as the descendant of a great seer, Cassandra Trolloni, she was subject to a considerable amount of scrutiny from others for most of her life, starting in childhood. Sybill Patricia Trelawney was born on the 9th of March, sometime before the year 1963, to a Muggle mother and wizard father. She was a half-blood witch, and, as I mentioned, the descendant of a famous seer named Cassandra Trolloni, who lived 3 generations prior. After Cassandra, no one possessed the famous second sight, or ability to see visions, that is, until Trolloni. At the age of 11, she began attending Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, presumably sometime around the year 1974. Before heading off to Hogwarts, however, Sybill got her wand at Ollivander's, 9.5 inches long, very flexible, and made of hazel and unicorn hair. When she arrived at the school, she was sorted into Ravenclaw House. From an academic standpoint, Trolloni was quite a good student, taking divination as an elective subject and achieving a high grade on both her owl and newt. Trolloni was also purportedly a member of Horace Slughorn's Slug Club, a club for Slughorn's most well-liked, accomplished, and sometimes famous students. Provided that Trolloni was the descendant of a famous seer, this is certainly within the realm of possibility. Eventually, Trolloni graduated from Hogwarts, and it was at this point in time that she developed a connection with her first romantic interest, a man that we don't know anything about other than his last name, Higglebottom. In a sort of tragic but funny sense, the marriage failed after Trolloni refused to take on his surname. We don't have much other information on this relationship at all. A new graduate with a marriage that had recently fallen to pieces, Trolloni went out into the wizarding world with hopes of finding a job. Her relation to the famous seer Cassandra Trolloni certainly helped to get her in the door for interviews, but she was often ridiculed for her gifts, as divination was not particularly welcomed by the wizarding world as a whole. This brings us to her application to Hogwarts. It was the year 1979, and Trolloni had met Dumbledore at the Hog's Head Inn. Like many other prospective employers, Dumbledore gave Trolloni a chance to apply because of her relationship to famous seer Cassandra Trolloni. However, even Dumbledore had his qualms with the field of divination, despite recognizing it as a legitimate field of magic. While interviewing for her position at Hogwarts, Dumbledore was actually quite unimpressed. On a cold, wet night 16 years ago, in a room above the bar at the Hog's Head Inn, I had gone there to see an applicant for the post of divination teacher, though it was against my inclination to allow the subject of divination to continue at all. The applicant, however, was the great-great-granddaughter of a very famous, very gifted seer, and I thought it common politeness to meet her. I was disappointed. It seemed to me that she had not a trace of the gift herself. I told her, courteously I hope, that I did not think she would be suitable for the post. I turned to leave. But of course, just as he turned to leave, Sybill Trelawney entered into a deep trance, foretelling the fabled prophecy, the same prophecy that would flip the wizarding world upside down. This was the prophecy that spoke of the Potter's altercation with Voldemort himself. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal. But he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord will be born as the 7th month dies. It's later revealed that Severus Snape, then a fully fledged Death Eater, was eavesdropping at the door. This led to Dumbledore hiring her in order to protect her from Lord Voldemort. However, Trelawney didn't properly join the faculty until 1981. When she began teaching at the school, she occupied a classroom on the 7th floor of the North Tower. It was here that she taught what she knew best, divination. Divination is an elective course taught at Hogwarts from 3rd year onwards. In essence, it's essentially the art of predicting the future. There are various ways to achieve this, and methods include, but are not limited to, tea leaves, fire omens, crystal balls, palmistry, cartomancy, astrology, and dream interpretations. However, despite joining the ranks of Hogwarts professors, her abilities were not welcomed by some members of staff, people like McGonagall, who truly believed that she was a fraud. Fully aware that some of her peers had a very poor impression of her, Trolloni very rarely left her tower and attended very few Hogwarts feasts. This was the case from 1981, when she started properly, all the way up to 1991-1992, when Harry first starts at the school. In 1992, we don't hear of Trolloni much, but we do know that at one point, Harry attempts to open her classroom door, which is locked. He then realizes that there's a notice on the door which says the following: "Do not disturb crystal gazing." In the 1993 to 1994 school year, Harry meets Trolloni properly for the first time when he joins her class. However, Harry only joined the class in the first place because Ron decided to. So, you may have chosen to study divination, the most difficult of all magical arts. I must warn you at the outset that if you do not have the sight, there is very little I will be able to teach you. Books can take you only so far in this field. In this first lesson, Trolloni made a few predictions: that Neville would break at least one teacup, that Lavender Brown was dreading October 16th, and that one of her students would leave her class forever. Later that same year, Neville broke 2 teacups, Lavender's rabbit was killed, and Hermione stormed out of her class. In this same school year, Trolloni ended up making quite a few other predictions that would also turn out to be true. The next was during Christmas, when she refused to dine at a table in the Great Hall, explaining that if she joined, then they would become an unlucky party of 13 people. In this situation, the first person to rise from the table is destined for death. While we didn't find out until much later on, Dumbledore was actually the first to rise, and incidentally, was the first to die, as Trolloni predicted. Next, in this same year, Trolloni entered into a trance and predicted that Voldemort's servant would be freed, returning to him that very night. This, of course, also ends up being true, with Scabbers being revealed as Peter Pettigrew. In the 94 to 95 school year, Trolloni became increasingly concerned with Harry Potter's well-being. She made predictions of his death, and made the assumption that Harry had lost his parents because he was born during winter. Harry, who was born in July, thought this was nonsense, but in reality, Trolloni was actually right once again, as what she was picking up on was the soul fragment from Lord Voldemort inside of Harry. The next school year, the 95 to 96 school year, was a particularly stressful year for Trolloni. This was because Ministry employee, later Hogwarts High Inquisitor, and later Headmistress Dolores Umbridge had begun her tyrannical reign at Hogwarts. Umbridge was particularly cynical in her view of divination, and continually asked Trolloni to justify her teaching techniques, proving the existence of her inner eye upon command. Umbridge continued to stalk Trolloni, pestering her to prove her abilities, and eventually put her on probation. Eventually, Umbridge fired Trolloni altogether. However, before she left the Hogwarts grounds, Dumbledore came to her rescue and told her that she could remain at the school if she wanted to. It was her home, after all. After being dismissed by Umbridge, Trolloni was replaced with the centaur Firenze, who taught divination in classroom 11. Eventually, however, Trolloni was brought back onto faculty when Umbridge was suspended. With Umbridge gone, she was free to teach again, but from this point onward, she would have to share classes with Firenze, who was kept on as a staff member. Fast forward to the 96-97 school year, and Trolloni was very much displeased with the fact that she would have to work with Firenze, who she didn't have a high opinion of. Unable to find a compromise, it was eventually decided that Trolloni would be solely responsible for the 5th and 6th years. She felt humiliated that she had to work with a horse, her words, not mine, and developed a bit of a problem with drinking sherry. She even got drunk at Horace Slughorn's Christmas party. Eventually, Trelawney hit a boiling point and demanded that Dumbledore fire Firenze. However, her demands were not met. The 97-98 school year was an unusual one. Voldemort, Snape, and the Death Eaters had taken over Hogwarts, and some of the teachers were even replaced. However, Trelawney was kept on, and given that she was a half-blood, it's likely that she just got lucky and flew under the radar. Eventually, when things really kicked off and the Battle of Hogwarts ensued, Sybill Trelawney fought valiantly alongside her allies. In order to assist with the efforts, she dropped crystal balls on people's heads, notably knocking out Fenrir Greyback while attacking Lavender Brown. After knocking out Greyback, she continued to fire crystal balls at the heads of Death Eaters, utilizing a tennis-like serve. That is, until the battle had been won. After the war had ended and peace had been brought back to the wizarding world, Trelawney continued to teach at Hogwarts well into the 2010s. Much to her delight, it's likely that, after the war, she was the sole divination professor once again. This is because Firenze was welcomed back to his herd of centaurs. The absolute last thing we hear about Trelawney is that she wrote a book entitled My Eyes and How to See Past Them, which explored Trelawney's exploits within the realm of divination. And that's, in effect, the entire life of Sybill Trelawney, at least as far as we know. The only thing that I left out of this video are some of her predictions, but I'm going to make a separate video in the future outlining them all. If you want that video, comment down below. If you enjoy the content, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, would anyone like me to help them interpret the shadowy portents within their orb?